Today we're talking about Daniel. Daniel is one of my favorite men to study about in the Bible. If you ever need a Cliff Notes version of who Daniel was, what his idea and determination as a Christian was all, or rather as a servant and child of God was all about, you just simply have to open to Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8. Because as we open up there, one of the first verses we find about Daniel is that he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. As we view that and as we begin thinking about that idea of not defiling himself, we find several ideas that we can think about with Daniel. Several things that we can look at as an example of his leadership. And things that we can examine that we should try and mimic of Daniel. And so as we begin, I want us to think about three separate points. And first of all, I want us to think that he was a prophet. He was also a leader, and he was very faithful. And so as we consider these 3 points, I would like for us to first think about Daniel being a prophet. What was a prophet? A prophet, simply put, was someone who was a spokesman or a messenger for God. Most prophets were given the ability of miracles so that they could confirm the signs that they were doing. They could confirm without a shadow of a doubt the things that they were saying was in fact from God. And yet, as we think about Daniel being a prophet, that's usually the first thing that comes to mind. We read passages such as Daniel chapter 2, as well as, I believe, chapters 6 and 7, and several other they're slipping my mind at the moment. But Daniel was, in fact, a prophet. That was the majority of what his work was. We find passages such as Daniel chapter 2, beginning in verse 31, when King Nebuchadnezzar had this vision, something that had scared him to the extent that he didn't know what was going on. It says he demanded of his soothsayers, those who were supposed to have the knowledge and supposed to have the ability to tell what the dreams were. And they couldn't. And they sent for Daniel, and Daniel was able to tell King Nebuchadnezzar about the interpretation. You might say, well, Haston, that's all well and good, but what does that have to do for us? Because I really enjoy taking the time to apply the lessons that we study, especially the things in the Old Testament, because after all, Paul did write to the Romans that whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning. So as we look at Daniel, what can we learn about being a spokesman for God? First of all, it takes doing it. We look at passages such as Matthew chapter 28 and verse 19, where Christ told his disciples to go and to teach. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. Verse 20 says, teaching them whatsoever things I've commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even until the end of the world. To be a spokesman for God and to be someone who stands up for God is something we all should do. Now, if we were to look at Daniel's life, it wasn't easy. Many times he was in fear of his life. The most notable idea of that is probably Daniel chapter 6, when Daniel stood and prayed. He kneeled and prayed, even though he knew it was against the law. We see Daniel in verse 22. We find him taking the time to bow down and kneel in prayer, even though he knew the writing was signed, even though he knew that there was a punishment for praying to God. What did he do? He did it. The determination that we find to be a spokesman for God from Daniel is something that I believe each one of us should do. It's not always going to be easy. Sure, today we don't have to worry about being thrown into a den of hungry lions. Today we don't have to worry about the idea that a king is going to have us put to death. But many times we think of things just as bad. Did you know a lot of people don't like it when a friend doesn't want to talk to them anymore? A lot of people are afraid of having someone say, I don't want to talk about the Bible with you. But yet we should take a page out of Daniel's book and stand and be a spokesman for God. One of my favorite verses about evangelism is Acts chapter 8 and verse 4. If you will, open your Bibles to that passage for just a few moments as we think about it. And this gives us the same idea, the same effective ability of Daniel, in the sense of his determination, his faithfulness. We find those first century Christians who had just endured the stoning of one of their friends. They had just understood persecution was coming upon the church. Acts chapter 7 closes and is really the entirety of the stoning of Stephen, a man who stood for God, a man who preached the gospel. And yet because the Jews of the time did not like it, they put him to death. And yet when we find Acts chapter 8 in verse 1, it says Saul was consenting unto his death. And at that time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem, and there were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. It paints a very easy picture for us in the sense that the Christians had to flee. If they stayed in Jerusalem, they would die. If they kept preaching, they would die. If they kept living the example of a Christian life, they would die. So they fled from Jerusalem, but was that the end of it? We look down at verse 4 and it says, Therefore they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the gospel, or preaching the word. That idea of being a spokesman for God should be in the very same idea as Daniel when he knelt down and prayed to God. When he knew it was illegal, when he knew there were people out trying to catch him, he prayed. When he knew it was something that was not going to be easy for the king to hear, guess what? He still gave the prophecy. We think of his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or as we oftentimes call them by the names that were given to them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These three men stood before the king and said, We will not bow down. And we're going to get to that here in just a few moments. But when we begin to see the idea of standing for God, we really should look at Daniel a lot more often. But as we continue on, we need to look at the idea of Daniel being a leader. Now, we often think, well, yes, Daniel was, of course, a leader. He was a prophet. He was a spokesman for God. He was someone who withstood the Babylonian captivity. But believe it or not, he was actually a leader in Babylon. We were talking a few moments ago about Daniel chapter 6, Daniel and the lion's den. But I would like for us to back up to the first 3 verses of that chapter. Because in this chapter, we immediately start to see the elevation that Daniel received, not only as a follower of God, not only as a captive and a slave in this hostile country, but to the extent that Daniel was a leader. Not only that, he was effectively second to the king. Because as it says in verse 1, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which would be over the whole kingdom, and over those were 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and the princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Think about that. Think about living such a faithful life to God, being such an example and living that example, that even the nation and the king raises you up. Someone that he knows that if there was ever a problem, he could just turn to Daniel and say, Daniel, take care of it. And it would be taken care of. Daniel was a leader in the nation of Babylon. Now let's think about that for a moment. If we go back to chapter 1 and really verse 1, and reading through the whole chapter, we find why that's strange. Beginning in verse 1, it says, In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hand and part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ahaspenaz, sorry about that, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes. We read on about all of this, and we find that Daniel and his 3 friends were a part of them. These were men taken as slaves. They were taken to be examples because the Babylonians were going to take the best of them. And they were going to make them their servants, showing complete and utter control over Judah. And then we fast forward a couple of years. We fast forward, just like we said, to Daniel chapter 6. And Daniel is now a leader in Babylon. He is very high in command. We think of all of that, and we think of the idea of him being a leader, and it's amazing. This one Hebrew youth that became a great second in command. So much so that he was serving the king for the entirety of the Babylonian captivity of roughly 70 years. In fact, I believe he even served a little bit after the Babylonian captivity ended. We think of this man being a leader. But he wasn't just a leader in the physical sense. He was a leader in the spiritual sense. Because he made sure that the life that he was living was faithful to God. He made sure that the life that he was living was that of a spiritual leader, someone that should be followed after. Isn't it great to have those examples? Being reared in this congregation, I think I was born on Wednesday night, if I'm not terribly mistaken, so I probably hindered a lot of y'all that night. But, in that very same idea, I know I wasn't too terribly old until I sat in the pews the first time, or was held in the pews. Thinking back over the time that I've spent with this congregation, I know there are men and women who have sat in these pews who have been wonderful Christian examples. Ones that have been to each one of us wonderful Christian examples. I could stand up here and name many of them, but I won't. Can those sitting in the pews beside you say the same thing about you? Are you the example? Are you a spiritual leader like you should be? Because guess what? When Daniel purposed in his heart, that affected others. We open our Bibles back to Daniel 1, verse 8. To give a little bit of summary, in verse 5, the king appointed daily provisions unto those captives. He was trying to fatten them up, and he was trying to make them look like Babylonians. The problem was, for those 4 Hebrew youths, that was against God's command for how they were to live. It was against God's command and their laws of how they were to eat, the things they were to eat, and the way that it was to be prepared. We find verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. We keep going, verse 12. He says, prove thy servants. Hold on a second. That's plural. That's more than one person. You back up to verse 11. It says, then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those three men whom we will be acquainted with in chapter 3. It was Daniel's initial idea that he would not defile himself, and guess what? Because of that example, we find three more Hebrews. We're following after it. Prove thy servant, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse or vegetables to drink and water, or vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenance be looked upon there before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants. That idea and that determination to be a spiritual leader of those around him. The idea that he was not going to give way unto the devil. He wasn't going to give way unto the king. He was not going to stop and let anyone take control of him. He was not going to let anyone defile him. So what did he do? He became a leader. The idea in the text here doesn't necessarily tell us how old Daniel was. I can tell you this, he was an old man when he died, some 70 years after this. Most likely, because it says he was a Hebrew youth, he will have been under the age of 20. When we consider all of these things, we find the idea of being a leader doesn't necessarily mean you have to be up in years. Any person sitting in this auditorium right now can be a spiritual leader. Be an example. Be the example that someone should follow, because guess what? I cannot speak for Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I don't know if they will have been faithful to God if they would not have been brought into Babylon with Daniel. But I do know this, in Daniel chapter 3, they were extremely faithful. There was not a single idea that they were unfaithful. Open your Bibles to Daniel 3, and we're going to be looking, for the most part, at verses 16 through 18. After Daniel chapter 2, and after the vision that King Nebuchadnezzar saw, it says in verse 1 that Nebuchadnezzar decided to make a golden image. He wanted to make it some, I believe, 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, this massive thing of gold. He commanded that every single one that was in any form of power be brought to Babylon. And there, as the music was playing and as this giant image was paraded down the street, they were all to bow. When we find Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, however you want to say it, we find that these three men were pointed out specifically as being the only ones who did not bow to this image. It doesn't say anything about Daniel, if he was there or anything else, but we find these three men. They didn't bow. In fact, in the very face of death, looking at the king who is ready to throw them into the burning fiery furnace, after King Nebuchadnezzar said, I'll give you a second chance, when the music plays, just bow down and that will be it. Then we find verse 16. In the middle of the verse, they begin by saying, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. Meaning they know what they're going to say, and it doesn't matter how they say it. We're not trying to tiptoe around the subject, we're going to face it. In verse 17 it says, If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of thine hand, O King. Now that's faith. The idea that they would be able to stand there and boldly say, our God will deliver us from your hand. But we follow it up with verse 18. But if not, be it known unto thee, O King, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. These men, our spiritual leaders today, we look at them and we can say we need to have faith like this. But that doesn't let us off the hook of being a spiritual leader, does it? Thinking back about what I mentioned a few moments ago, you can probably name 5, 10, 15 people who have affected your life for the better, spiritually speaking. In fact, I would encourage you to think about them for a moment. Men and women who, when the doors of the church were open, they were here. If they missed a service, you better be checking on because they were sick. Men and women who encouraged you. The people who were always being servants. Now, as we think about that, I want us to think about one thing. They gave a huge example. Daniel lived as an example of what a servant of God should be. Daniel lived as an idea of standing for God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were examples of how to stand against sin, stand against corruption, stand against every form of idolatry. We're commanded to be examples too, aren't we? I have 3 passages on that, and I want us to think about them together. First of all is Philippians chapter 1 and verse 27. Philippians 1:27. Paul writes, let your conversation be as it becometh the gospel of Christ, that whether I come and see you, or else be absent, I may hear of your affairs, that ye stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. That idea of conversation here is lifestyle. Because as we find this, we find Paul says, if I'm with you, or if I'm in another country, he said, I want to hear about you. Philippi was a major city. Philippi had a lot of people coming in and out, and Paul said, for every one of them, you better be an example because I want to hear about you. Live the Christian life. Teach others. Be the example. We find the idea as well in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12. Paul, writing to his own son in the faith, points out very clearly in a verse that many people have heard in their life, let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers. In word, the things you say. In conversation, the life you live. In charity, the way you love. In spirit, the way you act. In faith, the way you believe. In purity, the way you live again. Paul says, as a Christian, you better show people how to be a Christian. How? By living it. By saying it. By being the embodiment of the gospel. As we stand as Christians today, we better be the examples that we ought to believe. Why is that? What does our example ever do? Many of you know, after I graduated preaching school, before I moved to Kentucky to preach, I worked for about 3 months construction. In fact, within 2 days, my nickname was Preacher before they ever knew I was a preacher. Within about the first 6 hours, they were asking me why didn't I smoke, if I was going to join them for a drink that evening. Now, mind you, this was a Monday, and we got off work at 2:30, and they were going out to drink, but still. They asked me why I didn't cuss. They asked me why I was the way I was. That's what the Christian example does. When we truly embody being an example, people notice. Because if we notice our next passage, 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, Peter tells us why to be an example. Because Peter warns women. And I know I'm a young 24-year-old man. I've been married 2 years now, as of 3 weeks ago, something like that. I can't really say too much about marriage, the family, or women, but I can say exactly what the Bible says. Peter warns women about how to live as Christians, about marriage. He says in verse 1 of chapter 3, "Likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands." That's not the part I'm looking at. The part we're looking at is that if any obey not the word, they may without the word be won by the conversation of the wives, the life of the wives. They can see the example that their wives are living, and they can say, that's different. I want to know why that's different. I want to know about the gospel. Because it says in verse 2, while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear, righteous fear. Be an example. Because you truly never know what's going to happen. When they went into Babylonian captivity, that being these 4 men, they didn't know that one day one of them would be thrown into a lion's den. 3 of them would be thrown into a furnace that's burning so hot, it killed the men who threw them in. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. 70 years is a long time, isn't it? I'm only, a quarter of the way there? It's a long time. But yet when we consider their faithfulness, when we consider the idea that they were a spokesman for God, when we consider the idea that they were leaders, both by example and by leading, we find these are men that we ought to follow. And finally, I want us to consider the fact that they were faithful. We cannot imagine the things that they had to endure. They were faithful. Many of us have fairly easy lives. Did you know that? I'm the world's worst at thinking things are a whole lot worse than they actually are. I've spent years of my life worrying about things that will never come to pass, things that will never happen. I think life is so tough sometimes, especially around tax season. Taxes are the worst. Especially if you don't know, preachers' taxes are actually the worst. Because most of the time you have to pay employee and employer side. And it's a mess. But the thing is, we've never been in captivity before. Let's think for a moment about the choice of the word captivity. What do we usually call animals in the zoo that are caged up? Captives. They are raised in captivity. Children that were raised as slaves, children that were born as slaves were captives. That's the very idea of this Babylonian captivity. Life was not easy, life was not fun. But they were faithful to God no matter what. They knew it was because of sin that they were in this problem. They knew that one day, Lord willing, they would come out of this captivity. But they were going to stay faithful no matter what. In fact, let's open our Bibles back to Daniel 1 and verse 8. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. That one phrase should be said about us. The idea that he purposed himself that he would not defile himself. There was not going to be a single thing that could creep into his heart or his mind that he was going to cave to. That should be something that each one of us should want. That's something that each one of us should strive to be, faithful. Sure, he was captive. Sure, he had to endure many things, but guess what? He was not going to let sin be one of his problems. We look at chapter 6 and verse 10. We find during the decree of King Darius. It says, "Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, that of not having any petition asked of anyone other than King Darius, and once a Babylonian or Assyrian law was written, it was sealed. It was going to be there forever." And so it says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, now that he knew it was in effect, he went into his house, and his window being open in his chamber towards Jerusalem, it says he kneeled down upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed. It doesn't just say that he prayed, it says, and gave thanks before God as he did aforetime. This man was a captive in a hostile and foreign country, and guess what he did? He prayed and gave thanks unto God. He was faithful to God. We have a lot of things in our life that will cause us to stray, that will cause us to want to go off in another direction. But take a page out of Daniel's book and purpose in our hearts that we will not defile ourselves with sin. But we think about this, all 4 of these Hebrew youth that later became Hebrew men, that later became leaders of Babylon, they were faithful in death. While we're in Daniel chapter 6, let's look down at verse 22. It says, "My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut up the lion's mouth, that they have not hurt me. For as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt." Daniel wasn't afraid when he was thrown into a lion's den. He wasn't afraid when he knew death could be around the corner at any moment. We go to Daniel chapter 3. We look back at verses 16 through 18. In the face of the burning fiery furnace that was going to be heated up 7 times more than it should have been. The idea of near instant incineration. On top of that, these 3 men were going to be covered in all of their clothes, especially all of their winter clothes, it seems, as well. They were going to go up and be lit up like a candle. But what did they say? It doesn't matter, because either God's going to deliver us or He will not. No matter what the outcome is, we are going to stand for God. We are going to be faithful to God. Can we say that about ourselves? Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10. We like to quote the end of that verse so many times. "Be thou faithful unto death, and thou shalt receive a crown of life." There's more to that verse that we can study, but I want us to think about that passage and that verse for a moment. Guess what? Many times we state that wrongly. The idea is be faithful in the face of death, because guess what? Those Christians in that day were facing death. I don't know if you ever really have known what Nero did to Christians. What those after Nero did to Christians. It's well documented. Fed to dogs, fed to wolves, crucified. Here's my favorite though. They would be taken, beaten. Then they would most frequently be dipped in tar Then they would be stabbed through on a spear or a large pike type object. Then they would be lit on fire so that they could be the lantern for the garden at night. When John was writing to Christians about being faithful in the face of death, he's saying, stand as a Christian even if you get lit on fire and burned to death at the stake. Are we that faithful? Because we look at these men who were faithful, who were living their lives as Christians, and they embody Matthew 5:13 through 16. You're the salt of the world. But if the salt have lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out and trodden underfoot. If we are Christians who do not live a Christian life, we are good for nothing. Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle or set it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, that may give light unto all them there in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Be an example and be faithful, because people will see. We find that in Daniel's life. We find that in Daniel's teaching. We find that in Daniel's example. So be the light, be the example, be the spiritual leader for those around you. That's the best lesson I can ever give you from the book of Daniel. That's the best lesson I can ever give you from Daniel's life. Is be an example. Be someone that someone else can look to and say, that is who I want to be when I grow up. That is who I want to be the older and stronger I get. I thank you for your wonderful attention. I think the second bell is probably going to get me in just a second. But I did want to express my gratitude. This congregation has meant so much to me in my life. Each one of you have meant so much to me. I thank you for all that you've done over the years, because truly, I cannot ask for a better church home to be raised in. But that leads me to this final thought. And it's something I preached on Sunday morning. No matter how faithful, no matter how much we think we know about the Bible, there's still room to grow. One of the men who meant a lot to me, especially in preaching school, was Garland Elkins. He had several meetings here. I think my grandfather was listening to me. But anyway, Garland Elkins held several meetings here, especially when I was growing up. But in preaching school, he always said the biggest room in his life was the room for improvement. That should be said about each one of us as Christians. So thank you for your time, and I'll sit down now.